They really thought they were clever, pulling strings in shadows they assumed you couldn't see. They mistook your silence for blindness and your patience for ignorance, never realizing that every move they made was being observed with unsettling calm. They believed they were the ones in control because you never disrupted their performance. What they couldn't comprehend was that observation is often more powerful than interruption. They thought every win was theirs because you never contested it. They didn't understand that not every battle is meant to be fought in real time. They assumed your stillness meant indecision. What it truly meant was calculation. They thought you were slow to understand the game. They didn't realize you had already mapped every rule they were pretending to invent. They celebrated victories you never tried to stop. What they didn't know was that you stopped valuing winning the moment you started valuing clarity. They mistook your tolerance for submission. They never questioned why someone so aware would remain so calm. They believed they were manipulating circumstances, reshaping narratives, controlling outcomes. They never considered that the stage itself belonged to you. They assumed you were emotionally invested in every outcome. They didn't see that at some point, you shifted into quiet documentation. They thought you were struggling to keep up. They didn't realize you were letting the story fully expose itself. They believed your reactions were delayed because you were confused. They didn't see that you were choosing when to respond, not whether you understood. They felt powerful because you didn't push back. They never understood that power doesn't always announce itself with resistance. They assumed your endurance was desperation. They didn't recognize it as strategy. They treated your silence like permission. They didn't realize it was surveillance. They thought they were getting away with everything. They never asked why you weren't asking questions anymore. They believed your emotional availability meant vulnerability without limit. They didn't realize you had already detached from the outcome they were chasing. They mistook your kindness for obliviousness. They never imagined kindness could coexist with awareness. They thought you didn't notice the shifts, the lies, the contradictions. They didn't realize you were counting inconsistencies with quiet precision. They assumed your calm meant comfort. They didn't see that your calm had become distance. They thought they were writing the ending. They never suspected you were allowing the middle to unravel on its own. They felt bold because you didn't correct them. They didn't realize correction was no longer your role. They believed you were invested in preserving the illusion. They didn't know you were studying how the illusion sustained itself. They took your restraint as fear. They never considered restraint could be restraint from ending it sooner. They thought they were outsmarting you. They didn't see that you stopped playing to win a long time ago. They thought your delayed reaction meant emotional dependence. They didn't understand it meant emotional detachment. They assumed you didn't realize you were being used. They didn't realize you were letting it continue to understand its full shape. They felt untouchable because you never named what you saw. They didn't know naming it was never your goal. They believed your patience meant hope. They didn't realize hope had already left the room. They thought you were trapped in their narrative. They didn't know you had already stepped outside of it. They assumed your compliance meant agreement. They never questioned why you stopped defending yourself. They felt victorious because you didn't expose the truth immediately. They didn't realize timing is part of the reveal. They believed the illusion was secure because you let it breathe. They didn't see you waiting for it to collapse under its own weight. They assumed your silence meant you were losing. They didn't understand you were gathering everything you needed to leave cleanly. They thought they were playing you. They never realized you were letting the game finish itself. And this is the truth that lands with quiet weight when all the noise finally dies. You were not unaware. You were not naive. You were not helpless. You were watching. You were waiting. You were choosing your exit with surgical patience. They didn't play you into defeat. They played themselves into full visibility. And when the mask finally fell, you didn't confront it. You simply walked away with clarity in your hands and nothing left to prove. That's the part they still don't understand. You didn't lose the game, you outgrew it. They still replay moments where they thought they outsmarted you, not realizing those moments were never victories, only scenes you allowed to keep moving so the whole truth could expose itself without interruption. They assumed your silence meant you were behind. They never considered that silence was how you stayed ahead without revealing direction. They thought deception was working because you never challenged it. They didn't understand that truth doesn't always rush to interrupt lies. It often waits until lies collapse under their own effort. They believed they were bending reality around you. They didn't realize reality was quietly bending them into exactly who they had always been beneath the performance. They felt powerful because you didn't push back. They never recognized the difference between resistance and sovereignty. They were convinced they were teaching you a lesson. They didn't know the lesson was being documented from the first move to the last. They assumed your endurance meant dependence. They didn't realize endurance was just your way of letting their full character surface without opposition. They believed you were surviving their game. They never saw that you were studying the rules so you'd never step into another one like it again. They thought you stayed because you didn't know your worth. They didn't understand you stayed long enough to never doubt it again. They believed they wore masks you couldn't see through. They never realized you weren't trying to see through the mask, you were watching how long they could wear it before exhaustion exposed them. They assumed your calm proved their lies were convincing. They didn't understand your calm only proved how predictable their patterns had become. They felt untouchable because you didn't react. They didn't realize you had already touched the truth and simply didn't need to announce it. They thought they were operating in shadows. They never knew those shadows existed only because you stopped shining your energy on their behavior. They assumed your compliance meant surrender. They never imagined it was the quiet prelude to your withdrawal. They believed consequences required confrontation. They didn't understand that the most permanent consequences arrive without a single argument. They felt secure because you stayed present. They never noticed how emotionally absent you had already become. They thought you needed closure through conversation. They didn't realize your closure arrived through observation. They believed you would break when the game finally turned cruel. They didn't know the cruelty simply confirmed everything you already understood. They assumed you were still attached to the outcome. They didn't see that the outcome no longer belonged to you, it belonged to their exposure. They thought the reveal would come with drama. They weren't ready for the quiet precision of your departure. And this is where the truth finally locks into place without theatrics, without revenge, without apology. You were never confused. You were never fooled. You were never powerless. You were patient in a room full of performers. You were observant in a room full of manipulators. You were still in a room addicted to noise. They thought they were playing you. What they never accepted is that you were letting the entire illusion run its full course. So when you left, you would never question your decision again. You didn't exit in rage. You didn't expose in chaos. You didn't retaliate in noise. You exited in clarity, and clarity is the one thing no one can argue with. They may still believe they almost won, but the truth is simple, quiet, and permanent. They lost the moment. You stopped needing to prove you were ever being played at all. Their audacity didn't stop at the betrayal itself. It evolved into expectation, the expectation that you would still be present, still available, still reachable. As if loyalty was optional but access was permanent, as if they could damage you and still keep a front row seat in your life without earning it back. They crossed the line without hesitation, and when they turned around, they looked for you as if nothing had changed. As if betrayal was invisible. As if wounds were exaggerations. As if consequences were something you invented just to inconvenience them. They shattered trust with steady hands, then reached for your time with soft excuses. They wanted your presence without your protection, your warmth without the responsibility, your loyalty without the work of rebuilding what they destroyed. They assumed betrayal was a moment. You understood it was a transformation. Once that line was crossed, the dynamic shifted permanently, and they weren't ready for a world where they no longer had automatic entry into your life. They expected you to separate the wound from the person who caused it, to keep loving them despite what they broke, to leave the door open despite the smoke. They underestimated how final clarity can be once it arrives. They spoke to you as if nothing had changed. You listened like everything had. That alone ended the illusion. They spoke from entitlement. You moved from decision. They wanted to explain the betrayal away, thinking context could soften impact. You understood that explanations don't rebuild shattered trust. Damage doesn't rewind just because someone finds better words. They treated your forgiveness like a refundable policy, as if trust could be borrowed recklessly and returned later without loss. They forgot that every misuse permanently lowers the value of what once came freely. They wounded you and still expected front row seating in your life. Still expected availability. Still expected emotional updates. Still expected relevance in a future they helped contaminate. They confused past access with permanent entitlement. They forgot access expires when integrity disappears. They forgot loyalty is not a lifetime subscription, it renews only with consistency. They showed you exactly who they were, then acted shocked when you finally believed them. They wanted your doubt to protect them from consequence. You chose discernment instead, and discernment does not debate. They moved like betrayal was a phase. You moved like it was a verdict. They expected delays, appeals, negotiations. You delivered distance without discussion. They wanted comfort after causing chaos. They wanted peace from the person they destabilized. They wanted safety from the one they made unsafe. That contradiction exposed the core of their character. They expected generosity after disloyalty, mercy after manipulation, access after violation. They asked for everything they had already disqualified themselves from receiving. They thought your heart was public property, a space they could re-enter whenever guilt visited them. They didn't realize your heart became private the moment it broke. They wanted continued presence as proof they hadn't hurt you. They wanted your availability to erase their accountability. You denied them that illusion. They tried to speak to you the same way as before. You replied like someone who had learned too much. They felt the shift instantly, not because you announced it, but because access no longer felt automatic. They hated that your boundaries came without explanations. They wanted reasons to poke holes in, justifications to negotiate with. You gave them silence instead. They wanted to stay near the life they damaged, to witness your recovery without doing the work to earn proximity to it. You removed the reach entirely. They tried to appeal to the version of you that used to forgive easily. You answered from the version of you that survived. They called you cold for protecting yourself, but never called themselves reckless for betraying you. They labeled your self-respect as cruelty to escape accountability. They wanted to be the exception to the rule they forced you to learn the hard way. The rule that betrayal ends proximity. The rule that access follows respect. They asked for another chance as if it was a favor, not a risk that costs something real to extend. They treated trust like a game. You treated it like your life depends on it. They walked back into your world like they never left, ignoring the wreckage behind them, ignoring the bridge they burned, still expecting the door to be unlocked. They wanted to matter again. You showed them importance now comes with conditions, and they violated every single one. They tried to remind you of the good times as if memory could override behavior, as if the past could supervise the present. You paid attention only to patterns. They thought proximity would soften your stance, that time would weaken your spine. They underestimated what betrayal teaches. It teaches permanence in decisions. They wanted forgiveness with fresh access attached. You separated the two with surgical precision, choosing peace without re-entry, closure without contact. They wanted to stay after betraying you. You removed them without drama, without spectacle, without negotiation, the way people act when they finally value their peace. And the truth that will haunt them longer than your anger ever could is simple and final. They didn't lose access because you hated them. They lost access because you understood them, outgrew the version of yourself that tolerated disloyalty, and shut the door with clarity instead of noise. Their betrayal didn't shock you as much as what came after, the way they still tried to exist in your life as if nothing sacred had been violated, as if crossing that line hadn't altered the chemistry of everything between you. They acted like betrayal was an incident you could simply step over, not a fracture that permanently shifts how trust breathes. They wanted continuity in a story they themselves interrupted. They moved with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet accepted that access is not a right but a privilege sustained by consistency. And they broke consistency the moment they chose disloyalty. They behaved like your absence was temporary and your silence was negotiable. They never considered the possibility that your withdrawal was an answer, not a phase. They spoke to you with familiarity that no longer belonged to them. The comfort in their tone didn't match the distance they had earned. They wanted to remain emotionally close to the life they destabilized. They wanted front row seats to your healing without carrying the weight of accountability. They tried to step back into your world without acknowledging the damage they left behind, as if time alone could clean what only responsibility could. They wanted your forgiveness to function as a shortcut, not a process. Not a reckoning, just a reset button for their reputation. They wanted your empathy to rescue them from the discomfort of consequence. They wanted your compassion to blur what your clarity had finally made sharp. They used history as leverage, as if shared moments could be traded for future access. They ignored that history doesn't erase behavior, it only gives it context. They spoke as if betrayal was a misunderstanding. You knew it was a choice made clearly and without confusion. They wanted to convince you that their intentions mattered more than their actions. You had learned the cost of believing that lie. They reached for your life like your healing was public space they could wander into when guilt got heavy. They wanted to remain relevant in the chapter that began after them. They didn't understand that relevance requires alignment, not nostalgia. They tried to reinsert themselves casually, as if easing back into your presence would soften your memory. They underestimated how permanent understanding is once it arrives. They expected you to make room for them out of who you used to be. They were not prepared to meet who you became. They spoke to you like they still had emotional jurisdiction. You listened like someone who had reclaimed all authority. They wanted reassurance that they were still important. What they received was the quiet proof that importance now has conditions they no longer meet. They acted confused by your boundaries. They forgot boundaries only feel aggressive to those who benefited from your lack of them. They wanted to stay connected to your life because your strength reflected a version of themselves they no longer recognized or trusted. They wanted to watch you rise from the ruins they helped create without carrying the weight of having contributed to the collapse. They attempted to soften the past with present politeness. You understood that politeness after betrayal is not healing, it's avoidance. They wanted to be welcomed back into your emotional space without rebuilding the foundation they shattered. They wanted the house without repairing the damage. They treated access like something they could reclaim through persistence. They didn't understand that persistence without integrity is just pressure. They mistook your lack of confrontation for uncertainty. They didn't realize you chose distance because your certainty no longer needed noise. They thought silence meant you were still deciding. They didn't recognize silence as the sound of a door locking from the inside. They truly believed the story would end with you breaking down, apologizing, or begging for closure. They were prepared for sorrow, prepared for rage, prepared for desperation. What they were not prepared for was your disappearance without noise. They were ready for your pain. They were not ready for your transformation. They thought the twist would be you coming back one last time with tears in your eyes. Instead, the twist was you walking away with calm in your chest and certainty in your steps. They expected collapse. They got control. They expected you to spiral. You streamlined. They expected emotional chaos. You delivered emotional independence. They rehearsed speeches for the moment you'd confront them. They never imagined a version where you didn't need to talk at all. They were braced for revenge. They weren't braced for replacement by peace. They prepared themselves for your anger like soldiers preparing for war. What left them stunned was silence so steady it made their weapons pointless. They thought your heart would fight to be heard. Instead, your self-respect made the decision without consulting your wounds. They expected the story to bend back around them. Instead, the narrative cut clean and moved forward without a backward glance. They waited for the dramatic twist where you break. They never considered the twist could be you becoming unrecognizable to their expectations. They believed they knew your limits. They didn't realize your limits were built by their behavior. They prepared for impact. They weren't prepared for absence. They thought betrayal would make you desperate. It made you precise. They thought loss would weaken you. It refined you. They thought heartbreak would make you softer. It made you selective. They expected your healing to still include them. The real twist was discovering your healing began where their access ended. They planned for your reaction. They did not plan for your resolution. They wanted your response to define their importance. Your non-response ended that illusion permanently. They thought time would bring you back around. Time only brought you further into yourself. They assumed distance meant indecision. They learned too late that distance meant completion. They believed they were the turning point in your story. The real turning point was when you chose yourself without announcing it. They expected you to fold emotionally. You unfolded strategically. They braced for confrontation. They received erasure. They braced for accusations. They received closure without conversation. They expected you to demand answers. You chose not to need them. They were waiting for the breakdown. They got a breakthrough they weren't invited into. They thought your silence meant you were suffering. They didn't recognize silence as a decision. They expected the plot to revolve around apology. It pivoted on self-respect. They thought the climax would be you returning. It was you detaching completely. They thought the ending would be loud. It ended quietly, and that's what shattered them most. They kept waiting for the scene where they regained control. The real twist was realizing the story no longer included them at all. They expected regret to chase you. What chased them instead was irrelevance. They planned for your collapse. They did not prepare for your clarity. They assumed your heart would hesitate. They never imagined your spine would stand taller than your emotions. They expected the narrative to break you. You used it to rebuild yourself. They thought the plot twist would be temporary. They learned it was permanent. They thought the story would circle back. It closed the chapter instead. And here's the truth that still keeps them awake at night. The plot twist wasn't that you left. The plot twist was how completely you left. Without begging, without warning, without returning. They were ready for drama. They were not ready for detachment with direction. They were ready for heartbreak. They were not ready for self-loyalty. They were ready for your pain. They were not ready for your evolution. They thought they were prepared for anything you could do. They were not ready for the moment you stopped needing to do anything at all. That was the twist that destroyed every expectation they built. Not your anger, not your tears, not your confrontation, your completion, and that is why they still feel shaken. Because the greatest plot twist of all was discovering they were no longer part of the story. The moment you finally became the main character. They thought they understood how the ending would look because they memorized your old reactions. They built their expectations on your former softness, never considering that pressure changes the shape of a person. They assumed your emotions would betray you before you ever betrayed your attachment. They bet on your heart folding before your will did. They prepared for you to react the way you always had: emotion first, logic last. What dismantled them was watching logic finally take the throne. They expected your love to keep you accessible even after everything was ruined. They did not anticipate that self-respect would outrank history. They believed the twist would be dramatic and loud, something they could argue with or apologize their way through. They were not prepared for an ending that didn't invite discussion. They expected warnings. They expected emotional turbulence. They expected signs. What they received was outcome. They waited for your sadness to soften the door. What arrived instead was calm that sealed it tighter than anger ever could. They believed you would struggle longer with the decision. They never realized the struggle ended quietly long before your exit became visible. They thought you would be haunted by doubt. They weren't ready to face a version of you that finally trusted yourself completely. They expected your wounds to slow you down. Instead, those wounds sharpened your direction. They assumed heartbreak would scatter you. It aligned you. They prepared for mess. You delivered precision. They prepared for chaos. You delivered control. They prepared for a storm. You delivered a clean horizon. They thought your silence meant confusion. They didn't recognize silence as certainty taking shape. They expected regret to chase you in circles. What chased you forward instead was clarity. They believed your identity was too tied to them to survive detachment. They underestimated how much of you had been dormant, waiting to be released. They thought the ending would need their participation. They didn't know you had already finished the chapter privately. They expected their absence to weaken you. It refined you into someone they could no longer access. They waited for you to look back. You never did. They thought the twist would be emotional collapse. The real twist was emotional sovereignty. They believed your loyalty would delay the inevitable. It didn't. It simply made your exit cleaner. They prepared for a version of you that still needed them to validate the ending. They weren't ready for the version that validated itself. They thought the plot twist would be temporary. What crushed them was realizing it was permanent. They assumed your evolution would still keep them nearby. They did not consider that evolution sometimes requires total separation. And here is the ending they were never prepared to receive. The plot twist wasn't that you changed. It was that you changed without asking permission, without waiting for understanding, without needing approval, without leaving emotional doors unlocked. They were ready for your reaction. They were not ready for your resolution. They were ready for your pain. They were not ready for your power over it. They were ready to witness your struggle. They were not ready to witness your independence from it. And the truth that will always haunt them is this: you didn't escape loudly. You didn't depart dramatically. You didn't leave them with chaos. You left them with finality. And that was the twist that shattered everything they thought they knew about you. They kept waiting for the moment you would second-guess yourself, the moment doubt would crack your certainty and send you circling back to what was familiar. What unsettled them most was realizing that doubt never came. They expected loneliness to drag you back. They never imagined solitude would become your sanctuary and not your punishment. They told themselves your strength was temporary, fueled by shock or pride. What broke that illusion was watching your stability remain long after the dust had settled. They hoped time would soften your resolve the way it softened your memories. They didn't realize time was reinforcing your decision with every peaceful day you lived without them. They thought your silence was an emotional pause. They didn't understand it was the sound of a chapter being archived, not postponed. They waited for you to feel the weight of what you lost. What stunned them was witnessing the weight you finally set down. They imagined your confidence would fade when no one clapped for it. They didn't grasp that your confidence no longer required an audience. They believed your independence was a posture. They learned too late it was a permanent posture, one built from scars, not arrogance. They expected your ending to need their acknowledgement. What destroyed that fantasy was realizing your ending didn't even remember to look back. They thought the plot twist would leave loose ends they could pull on. What shattered them was discovering there were no threads left to reach. They hate the way you didn't make a scene out of their exit. No grand confrontation, no dramatic collapse, just a clean removal, as if their role in your life had always been temporary. They thought they were a main character in your story, the kind whose presence reshapes the entire plot. What shattered them was realizing they were only a moment important once, but never permanent. They expected their absence to leave a crater. What it left was space, and nothing bruises the ego like realizing your silence is not suffering its breathing room. They didn't expect to be edited out so smoothly, no flashbacks, no lingering meaning, just a quiet cut that didn't even pause the narrative. They hate that you didn't need closure with them to move forward. They needed it to feel significant. You didn't. They wanted your life to stagger after them. It kept walking. They wanted your story to bend backward in grief. It leaned forward in momentum. They hate that your healing didn't require their apology. They hate that your peace didn't require their explanation. They hate that your growth didn't carry their name. They scroll through your life looking for traces of where they used to stand. What unsettles them is how quickly the space repurposed itself without hesitation. They waited for the delayed breakdown everyone promises comes after detachment. What arrived instead was your consistency. They thought they would haunt you. What terrifies them is realizing they are the ones stuck with memories that no longer live anywhere but inside them. They replay the chapter where they mattered, trying to stretch it into relevance again. You already turned the page. They assume they'd be remembered as essential. The truth that breaks them is discovering they were instructional. They hate being reduced to a lesson instead of a legacy. They hate being remembered only as the reason you learned your limits. They hate that they are now a reference point, not a destination. They thought removing them would be painful for you. What it became was efficient. They mistake your quiet for weakness. They don't understand that erasure requires more strength than confrontation. They expected to be missed. Being replaced by peace insults them more than replacement by a person ever could. They wanted to remain a factor in your decisions. What dismantles them is realizing you don't even calculate around them anymore. They hate that you didn't rewrite history to make them look better. You left it exactly as it was and walked out of it. They hate that you didn't villainize them publicly. You demoted them privately. They hate that you didn't keep them as a scar. You kept the skin and discarded the wound. They expected to live in your regret. They now live in your indifference. They don't understand how someone can once be central and then become irrelevant without a fight. That confusion is the punishment. They want acknowledgement for the role they played. The silence they receive is the final credit scene and their name isn't in it. They hate that your story didn't pause when their chapter ended. It accelerated. They hate that you didn't collapse when the bond broke. You aligned. They hate that the version of you who needed them no longer exists. They hate that the version of them who mattered to you no longer exists either. And the truth they will never be ready to face is this: you didn't erase them out of bitterness. You erased them out of necessity. You didn't remove them to hurt them. You removed them to protect the story you're still writing. You didn't demote them because they were nothing. You demoted them because they stopped being right for the plot. They hate being remembered as a side character. They hate that you didn't let them die a hero in your memory. They hate that your life continued without keeping their shadow in the frame. But the final cruelty, the one that will echo the longest, is this: you didn't erase them like an enemy. You erased them like a transition. And nothing hurts the ego more than realizing they weren't the ending. They were just the scene that taught you to leave. They still tell the story as if they mattered longer than they did. They stretch moments, exaggerate roles, inflate impact because shrinking back into the truth feels like emotional disappearance. They hate that your memory of them doesn't match their memory of themselves. In your version, they are brief. In theirs, they were pivotal. That mismatch fractures their ego daily. They can't stand that your present doesn't flinch when their name is mentioned. No pause, no shift, no emotional weather, just nothing. They expected nostalgia to protect them from irrelevance. They didn't realize nostalgia only works when both people still visit the past. They keep asking others about you, not because they miss you, but because they need proof they once mattered. They are disturbed by how easily new meaning entered the empty space they left. They wanted vacancy to last longer. They imagined your life would echo with their absence for years. What echoes instead is your focus. They hate that your story didn't become a memorial for what was lost. It became a blueprint for what's next. They thought erasure required anger. What terrifies them is learning erasure can be calm. They thought removal required justification. What destroys them is realizing it only required decision. They assumed impact guaranteed permanence. They didn't understand that impact can be temporary and still necessary. They wanted you to archive them as a defining chapter. You archived them as a turning point. They hate being remembered as the storm that passed instead of the home that remained. They hate that your life no longer checks their shadow before stepping forward. They feel replaced by time itself, no rival, no betrayal, no dramatic exchange, just time doing what you gave it permission to do. They wanted your grief to keep them alive in you. You chose growth instead. They wanted regret to stitch their name into your future. You chose clarity. They thought history would protect them from being forgotten. They didn't realize history only protects what is revisited. They hate that your peace erased them more thoroughly than hatred ever could. They don't understand how someone can once be significant and later be unnecessary without either person being evil. They wanted their exit to scar you. It streamlined you. They wanted your story to limp after them. It found rhythm. They wanted to remain an emotional landmark. They became a footnote. They wanted you to remember them as irreplaceable. You remembered them as completed. And here is the final truth that seals their anger into silence. You didn't erase them because they were worthless. You erased them because they were finished. You didn't remove them to punish them. You removed them to protect what comes next. You didn't forget them out of weakness. You released them out of strength. They hate being reduced to a side character. They hate that your chapter didn't need them to become meaningful. They hate that your story didn't collapse without their lines. But the ending they will never escape is this. You didn't erase them to feel powerful. You erased them because you finally understood who the story was actually about. And it was never them. They keep wrestling with the moment they lost their position in your story, trying to pinpoint the exact sentence where they were edited out. What destroys them is realizing it wasn't a moment, it was a pattern they ignored. They assumed their presence was permanent simply because it had once been loud. They never understood that permanence is earned through consistency, not noise. They still speak about you as if they have narrative rights, as if your life owes them continuity. What humbles them is discovering that stories don't ask permission to evolve. They feel insulted by how naturally you reclaimed the space they once occupied. No ceremony, no memorial, just forward motion like they were always meant to be temporary. They wanted to remain a reference point in your decisions. Now they aren't even a variable. They don't influence direction. They don't affect speed. They don't shape outcome. They thought being erased would feel explosive. What shattered them instead was how quiet it was, like a door closing so softly it took time to realize it would never open again. They expected your future to carry the outline of their absence like a missing puzzle piece. What unsettles them is realizing the picture looks complete without that space. They imagined you would one day look back and wonder, what if? What strips them of power is knowing you look forward and ask, what's next? They believed time would soften your decision. What time actually did was validated with every peaceful day you lived without their interference. And in the final accounting, the truth that will always sit at the core of their resentment is this: you didn't erase them by accident. You didn't forget them in confusion. You didn't lose them in chaos. You removed them with clarity. And nothing is more humiliating than realizing you weren't destroyed by someone's anger. You were dismissed by their certainty.